Everybody, my name is Brian Stacy, and today I'm going to talk to you about my philosophy on the future of college football recruiting, as well as why I think analytical general management is going to be the main driver in successful college programs going forward. So, a little bit about myself before I get into things. I played wide receiver at Carnegie Mellon for the past 4 years, where I was lucky enough to be a part of the program's most successful era, and I got to win a couple conference championships. But beyond that, I served as the program's assistant director of recruiting, where I led the program's graphic design efforts as well as helped with some other recruiting operations. But I also got to get some hands-on coaching experience, which was really cool. And I got to coach the wide receivers and tight ends during spring ball this past year. But currently, I work at Goldman Sachs in Chicago. Um, but don't be mistaken, my true passion is football. I try to find football work whenever I can get it. Um, and my long-term goal is to be just like my older brother. I take inspiration from him. He's the general manager of Wyoming men's basketball team, and so just like him, I want to be a general manager at either the college or professional level one day. But my immediate focus is on securing a role on either a college staff or an NFL staff to get some real experience in player evaluation and roster management because I really feel like I could help make a difference in a winning way on a college or NFL team. But obviously, I love football. It's what I want to do. And so, with that in mind, I always try to find football work. And with that, I worked with Brian Payton at his new recruiting startup while also balancing my job at Goldman Sachs. But with Brian, I helped him in recruiting and advocacy efforts with some transfer athletes, some of the high school guys coming up. And that was really cool because I got to see how recruiting works in that way. But enough about me and what I've done, but I'm here to talk about a couple things that I made, as well as how I think they can impact recruiting in college football in a really positive and futuristic way. So, what did I make exactly? In simple terms, I made a statistical metric and I made a tool to go along with that metric. First, about the statistical metric, I made a stat called WA, or wins added, or wins above average. And if you know what WAR is in baseball, it's essentially the same thing, but for football. Um, it's how many wins a player contributed to his team over the course of a season. Um, and it's really the most comprehensive and best statistic in terms of valuing a player as it relates to winning football games. Um, I developed this metric in order to really try and quantify player impact beyond traditional stats like yards, touchdowns, carries, tackles, and all the stats that everybody already knows that don't really carry any substance. Um, and I did this by integrating advanced efficiency metrics, taking into account situational performance, play-by-play data, and through doing all that, it really is the most comprehensive and best statistic when it comes to valuing players as it relates to winning games. Um, and it's cool because it's unlike conventional stats like yards, carries, and all those, because it accounts for position specific responsibilities. So obviously the needs of a receiver are different from the needs of a D lineman. And this stat accounts for that. And this really offers a data-driven approach to valuing and assessing talent and players. Um, and it'll allow coaches and analysts to really make more informed decisions regarding player utilization, game planning, and roster construction. So that's the stat. Wow. Wins above average, wins added, same thing. Wow. And then I made this tool, which I'm going to demonstrate shortly, um, that essentially goes along with this stat. So you can type into this tool a player's name, where you want him to transfer to, and how many snaps you want him to play on this new team, and it will project his stats in a almost scarily accurate way at this new transfer. But I created this with the goal of being able to make sense of the dynamic college football environment right now, because everything is really complex with the transfer portal and having there be two time slots for when it's open. And I wanted to be able to make sense of all that and enable coaches to navigate the portal more efficiently and be able to leverage this tool with their recruiting strategy. So essentially, this tool aggregates player data across multiple levels, Division two through FBS, and it applies a weighted multiplier system to project the transfer stats. Um, but it also looks at historical trends from teams, players, and like position groups. And but based on whatever team you want a player to transfer to, it'll adjust for the positional needs of the team, and it'll also analyze team fit. Um, and so it really just provides a detailed, structured framework for evaluating talent uh, for recruiting staffs. And I think this will help a staff optimize roster construction and provide a competitive advantage because it'll help identify undervalued talent. It'll really just enable a recruiting staff to have an advantage over every other team in an analytical way. Now, I'm going to switch screens here in just a second and show you how the tool works. Um, so I'm going to do that right now. But I'm really excited to share it because I think you'll be able to see pretty quickly the value in this tool, um, and why it can really be impactful to any team, any team. Uh, so before I demonstrate the tool, I think about this a lot. I think about how if you were asked to be the general manager of a team starting from scratch today, like, would you build it the same way as a team was built 30, 20, or even 10 years ago? Like, would you recruit players based off the eye test, or would you recruit them based off of a highlight reel from limited in-game college film? Or like, would you recruit them based off of a 40-yard time from a camp or anything like that, or even recruiting rankings from high school? Would like if you answer yes to that, I just think you're behind already because the game has changed. It's moving in a more analytical direction. And we used to believe that like success was just about talent acquisition. And with that, you find the best players, you put them on the field and you let them play. And while that is a big part of how you win in football, just letting the athletes do their thing, make like good players make plays. I think going forward and now, the most successful teams at both the college and pro levels are winning in the margins. They're not just getting the best players, but they're finding the right players and they're finding them at the right cost and putting them in the right roles. And through that, they're building sustainable winners by understanding the value better than their competitors. So they understand the value better than the competitors, which is how they're winning nowadays. But I also like to think about how for the longest time, like college football was an arms race. It was all about who had the biggest stadium, the biggest facilities, and the most 4 or 5 star recruits. But look at what's happening now. You'll see teams are hiring general managers, and college football is becoming more like the NFL because roster construction and roster optimization is no longer just about recruiting. It's about managing assets. It's navigating the transfer portal, understanding NIL, and balancing long-term sustainability with short-term success. And so I like to think about that a lot. But in my opinion, in my philosophy, the job of a modern college football general manager is not just signing high school recruits. It's about projecting who will develop. It's about identifying undervalued transfers, and it's about optimizing roster spots based on need and fit, just like people do in baseball. Um, but I think we're seeing this shift because football has more data available now than ever before. You'll see play-by-play efficiency metrics, athletic tracking data like 40 yard, stuff like that, NIL valuations. Yet, despite all this data, teams are still operating in their recruiting departments like it's 2005. Um, and I think that the best programs are the ones that embrace an analytical approach. So, enough about that. I really think that my tool, you'll be able to see quickly how, like, the value in it. Um, I'm fixing my mouse right now. It didn't work, but so this tool, you see the screen, all you have to do is type in a player's name and what team you want them to transfer to and how many snaps you want them to play. So I'm going to look at a really cool example with Notre Dame. Riley Leonard, he kind of came onto the scene this year as like a really great quarterback that nobody really knew of because he transferred to Notre Dame, came from Duke, didn't play a whole lot at Duke. Um, but I look at this tool and we can really see some cool things from the perspective of the Notre Dame recruiting staff with the tool. So if we look at Riley Leonard, these were his stats at Duke last year. Threw for just over 1,000 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 picks, got sacked 9 times, like nothing crazy. Played 382 snaps. Now, if you were the Notre Dame recruiting staff last year, you went to the portal to get a guy because maybe you weren't fully trusting of the people that were coming up as backups or the guys that are coming from high school. Regardless, they weren't comfortable with their options, so they went to the portal. And if Notre Dame had access to this tool last year, they could have had some certainty and some real good feelings about Riley Leonard because I'm sure like now they look at it, they're very happy with him. But at the time, I'm sure they were a little bit uncertain. Like there's that degree of uncertainty because Riley Leonard, he didn't play a whole lot at Duke. Like, how's he going to perform at Notre Dame besides like academics? Because we know he can keep up. He came from Duke. But so these are his stats from last year. Didn't play a whole lot. Now we're going to look at his stats from this year. So these are Riley Leonard's stats from this year. Pass for 28, 51 yards, 21 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, got sacked 19 times, as well as his really good running statistics. He played 944 snaps, and it's pretty standard for starting quarterbacks that start the whole year to play anywhere from 800 to 1,000 snaps over the course of a season. So if Notre Dame had access to this tool last season, they could have looked at Riley Leonard and scaled up his performance. How would he have done at Notre Dame? Or how would he do at Notre Dame? So we plug in Notre Dame, 944 snaps, which is what he had. Um, and you see his projected stats. They're pretty damn close. Um, 2788 compared to 2851 yards. That's like 70 yards off, 60 yards off from what he actually threw. 21 touchdowns is what he projected, which is actually what he threw. And then you see 8 interceptions projected, which is actually what he threw. And then he got sacked 23 times, is what he projected, but he actually got sacked, I think, 19 times, like 4 off. And I think the value in this tool not only comes from its accuracy in projecting players' performance and statistical output when it comes to any transfer scenario, but it also comes from my experience as a football player. Because when you see these analytical tools come out from the math guys, like coaches don't really understand all that statistical jargon. Like this tool is the opposite. You plug in the player's name, what team you want them to transfer to, how many snaps you want them to play, and you see the output. And I think that's really unique because it's a it's an analytically advanced tool that's easy for every football coach to understand. And so we can do this for any player, Division two through FBS for offense or defense. It's the same thing down here, just defensive players. Um, so let's look at like Ashton Genty. How would he do on any other team? Oops. So Ashton Genty, he played for Boise, and these were his stats: rushed for like 2,600 yards. You see his stats. He's a great player. How would he do if he transferred to Baylor, a Big 12 team, and played the same amount of snaps? Well, Baylor's a little bit tougher of a league. He'd probably be a great player still, and that's why he's going to go top 10 in the draft, but he wouldn't be as good. Like he wouldn't put out as much because it's a Big 12. You're playing harder teams, bigger guys, stronger. Like you know why he's not going to play as well, but he'd still be a great player. And you see the guy's WA right here. For Boise, he contributed 2.71 wins to Boise State this season. And if he were to transfer to Baylor, he would contribute roughly 2.37 or 2.4 wins to Baylor. Like he'd still be a great player. And like LeJontay Wester, a good receiver for Colorado. If he were to play at Baylor, he would, it's another Big 12 team. He'd probably perform pretty close to the same, uh, given the same amount of snaps. Yeah, close to the same. But Baylor has a good receiver, Josh Cameron or Jordan Cameron, one of the two, who's already there. Like it'd be tough to replicate this. Um, let's say he were to transfer down to like Princeton, play the same amount, he'd be a great player. Like he'd have over 1,000 yards, and you'd see his stats. And I think the value of this tool is really cool because it's scarily accurate in how well it predicts players' outputs given any transfer scenario. Um, but I'm going to get into the why shortly here and why it can be really, really useful for general managers and staffs when it comes to knowing what to pay players. Now, this player value and the new value, I'll get into that too. But before I switch back to my presentation, um, I kind of just want to like I think about these things too. Like if we think about roster construction in the way, like I work for Goldman Sachs. So if we think about roster construction the way a Wall Street trader looks at an investment portfolio, then recruiting is all about asset allocation. And right now, college teams are wasting assets by overvaluing certain traits and ignoring others. And in my opinion, you see this through like the 5-star, 4-star trap, because we've all seen teams chase after 5-star recruits because of their ranking, not because they fit their system or project well over time. The reality is a well-developed 3-star with elite efficiency numbers and metrics often has a higher development and hit rate than a raw 5-star who just tested well in shorts and a t-shirt. Like everybody knows that. So think about it. If we only value baseball players based on how hard they hit a ball during batting practice, then we'd miss the guys who can actually hit in a game. It's the same for football. Camp performances and raw measurables don't always translate, and that's why teams like Iowa and Wisconsin turn these raw, unheralded recruits into first round draft picks, while schools with top 10 recruiting classes are missing bowl games. And another like main thing that I think about is how guys are overpaying for skill positions and underpaying linemen. And you see it in the NFL too. Teams are overpaying quarterbacks and wide receivers in free agency while they fail to invest in the offensive line. We see the same thing in college recruiting. Everybody wants the flashy skill guys, the flashy quarterback with all the Instagram followers, but the best teams dominate in the trenches. Um, Georgia didn't win back-to-back national titles because they had the best receivers. And while they did have great receivers, they won because they controlled the line of scrimmage. The best run programs are allocating resources where they create the most impact. And if you're paying top dollar for a transfer wide receiver, but ignoring the fact that your offensive line gave up 35 sacks last season, then you're mismanaging your assets. And in today's game, data tells us that pass protection correlates more strongly to offensive success and winning more than wide receiver talent alone. And that's where the analytics give you an edge. And so the last point that sort of ties in my creation of WA and my tool is that the transfer portal is the biggest inefficiency in college football today. It's essentially free agency, but most programs still treat it like traditional recruiting. You'll see teams that like the teams that will thrive are the ones who don't just go after the biggest names, but rather find the players who fit specific needs for the right value. Guys who might not have big numbers, but they grade highly in efficiency metrics. Those are the guys that teams need to be looking for as opposed to just the flashy dudes. And so that's why we're seeing teams flip the script on their fortunes pretty quickly. They're able to identify impact transfers rather than just chasing the highest rated ones. And the portal is really an opportunity to fix weaknesses on a roster in real time, but only if teams evaluate impact per snap and not just total yardage or traditional stats like that. Volume volume stats can lie, but efficiency does not, and neither does WA. And so I like to think about those things. But back to my tool, um, I'm going to switch screens back to my presentation. So I made the tool and I made the stat. And what do we do with it? The value I already explained. You can see it through the examples uh, on the tool itself, but the value comes from my experience as a player and my academic and just my background. I really think I have a unique background when it comes to knowing how football works and what is truly valuable in a good player. And the value also comes from just the stat itself. It's able to accurately predict to a pretty cool level. So that's where the value is in this. But just to further highlight some use cases for the tool and some examples of where it could be useful, um, finding players that fit, like I've been explaining, is super important going forward. So let's say you're on a coaching staff and you're in the middle of the season. You don't really have a recruiting plan in place yet for the portal because it's kind of far out, but you want to get ahead. Um, this tool, along with the stat that I created, you'll be able to see the guys early on that might enter the transfer portal. So, just as an example, I looked at the top five non-senior group of five receivers through week 4 this past season, and 6 out of the 8 top guys ended up entering the transfer portal. So, with that in mind, if you're a staff that's busy making like scout team cards during the season or game planning, you could just quickly look at this and see the names and have an idea of who's going to be there when that time comes. And just having that in mind, you can start to develop the relationships early on or at the right time. So that way it ensures that when the transfer portal opens, there's already a well-researched and established recruiting strategy and relationships in place. And so that just getting that little edge is really helpful. And then another use case, like I explained earlier, is scaling performance and finding the guys that fit your team. And I did this with Sam Hartman and Riley Leonard. We saw the stat projections and how close they were. Like you can see this for any player that transfers. It's almost dead on. Um, and you see this, and this will just enable staffs to be able to find the right guys and have confidence in it. Um, and Riley Leonard, like he didn't have a lot of stats at Duke, so they maybe didn't have to pay him as much. And it's just finding those little ways to save money, but maximize output and value that is going to be crucial going forward for uh, successful college programs. And when we look at like pay examples, in the NFL, you'll even find inefficiencies, but the following data is based upon 2025 NFL salary cap allocated to each position. Because in NFL offices, you'll see like a certain percentage of the cap be allocated to certain positions. And these percentages are typically what you'll see. Um, but if you were to follow this and push it down to the college level for a team that has, let's say, an $8 million budget, this is how much you'd be putting towards each position. And so this gets you thinking like, okay, we're paying our wide receiver 880,000, but he doesn't produce that much, and next year he wants even more from us. Like this will just get the staff thinking like, okay, maybe we should look in the portal because we can find a guy who will scale better, fit our team, and like he's not going to be asking for $1 million instead of like what our guy now is asking for. And so it just really enables you to have an analytical approach to your recruiting and roster management and just like finding the right guys and putting them in the right spots and paying them the right amounts. Um, so that's just another way that this could be used. And then other examples, you can read it, but Colorado lost Travis Hunter and Shador Sanders, and together they were responsible for like 5 wins for Colorado. Um, that's going to be tough to replace. So they could trust Julian Lewis, who doesn't have any college stats yet, but like, and he'll probably be great. But with the tool, you could maybe look at another guy and have some type of idea of what he'll contribute at Colorado. But either way, it's cool because you can see, you can like replace the wins with this tool, like hypothetically see where you're at roster wise. And then another example, like everybody knows Nick Emmanwori, like amazing safety for South Carolina. Um, he's leaving, and South Carolina, if they like having a really good safety all the time, then they could look in the portal and like find which guys will project well on their team. And to do that, they could like look at Kendall Daniels, who's another big body safety who's really good. Um, but yeah, it just gives coaches and staffs an idea of what they're losing and what they're gaining from certain players and transactions within their roster. But beyond just the wah and the tool, um, my belief is that analytics as a foundation are going to be what drives running a winning program going forward. Um, it's really about understanding how to integrate the analytics in a difference-making way. And this tool that I created along with WA is really the most notable and easy way to do so. Um, but programs that really think analytically, in my opinion, are going to drive the following things through analytics. And the list is here: player evaluation and acquisition, player development, transfer portal and contracts, lineup optimization, game strategy, workload, snap optimization, injury prevention, managing payroll, long-term roster construction, recruiting strategy, and scouting. Um, all this stuff is really cool. And it matters because by integrating analytics into every aspect of roster construction and running a team, football teams are going to win more games with the same or lower payroll. They're going to find undervalued talent and minimize gaps in talent in their roster from starter to backup, just really fortifying their team's strength. They're going to mitigate risks in contracts, injuries, and performance. And they're going to extend their championship windows by taking a long-term analytical approach. Um, and teams that fail to do this will fall behind. Um, but that's all that I have. And I'd love to answer any questions or talk about this. I'd love to talk about this with anybody. So reach out to me. I currently work for Goldman Sachs, but my immediate goal right now is to join college football staff or an NFL staff in any way. And I just love football and I'd love to talk about all this stuff. So please reach out to me below. My cell is 847-287-9113. My email is stacybryan6@yahoo.com. My Twitter is Brian L. Stacy. But yeah, that's all I've got for you today. Um, yeah, just one last look at the tool here, and I'll wrap things up. So it's yeah, but I guess for final takeaways in terms of like the tool and everything, like football's evolving, and the best teams are going to be the ones that adapt first, and the teams that cling to outdated recruiting strategies and overpay in the transfer portal and ignore efficiency metrics, they're going to be the ones that struggle in staying competitive in the next 5 years. Uh, and the programs that think like general managers should, and not just recruiters, are going to own the future of this sport. Um, and now, I guess like another important thing is analytics are not here to replace scouting. Um, like, don't let the numbers tell your eyes lies, is what I like to say. But analytics are here to enhance decision making. And I don't want to ignore the tape, but I do want to eliminate bias. Um, and I want to find hidden value and I want to maximize roster construction. Like, I want to optimize that. And if your program isn't thinking like this already, you're giving away wins. Um, but yeah, that's what I love about this, and I'd be happy to talk about my tool to anybody. And yeah, again, I work at Goldman Sachs. My immediate goal is to secure a role on a college or a pro team. And please reach out to me, 847-287-9113, stacybryan6@yahoo.com, Brian L. Stacy on Twitter. Thank you guys. See ya.